Welcome. It is exactly noon Pacific time, so we are going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all so much for joining this month's webinar, Soil, Carbon, and Communities, Regenerative Techniques That Work. I am Leslie Lindo, the Director of Community Engagement for BALLE, and today I'm pleased to be joined by Nikki Silvestri, who will be moderating the discussion, and Sallie Calhoun and Euneika Rogers-Sipp, who will be going deep into the work they're doing to revitalize and invest in the land and family farms in their communities. For those of you who are new to BALLE, we are the fastest growing business alliance of values-aligned entrepreneurs, business networks, and local economy funders in North America. At BALLE, we create real prosperity by connecting leaders, spreading solutions that work, and attracting investment towards local economies. In this webinar, we will have 45 minutes of presentation and then open it up to questions from the audience. To ask a question, please click the chat icon at the bottom right corner of your screen and type your question into the chat box at any time during the discussion. In the last 10 minutes, I will select questions from the chat to be posed to Nikki, who will ask the speakers. The public webinar will close at 1 p.m. Pacific time, and BALLE champion members and their guests are invited to remain in the room for a 30-minute private Q&A with the speakers. If you are unable to see the video of the speakers, please click the icon that represents heads of people. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Nikki Silvestri. Over the last 10 years, Nikki has been a thought leader in creating social equity for underrepresented populations in food systems, social services, public health, climate solutions, and economic development. She had the honor of being named the Roots 100 Most Influential African Americans in 2014. During her time as Executive Director at Green for All, Nikki led initiatives that placed vulnerable communities at the center of the climate fight. As the former Executive Director of People's Grocery in Oakland, Nikki increased the organization's profile as a national thought leader on food systems development for vulnerable communities. We are also extremely honored to have Nikki as one of our fellows from the 2013 cohort. So Nikki, the stage is all you.
Thank you, Leslie, for that wonderful introduction. This topic is something that's very close to my heart. As Leslie said, I've worked in climate change and food systems for years. And when I think about regenerative agriculture techniques, soil, carbon, etc., it's this beautiful merge of the two. Regenerative agriculture is the way that climate solutions come together with food systems in a way that actually makes a better world for all of us. So I couldn't be happier to be talking about this today. I'm also really happy to be in conversation with these incredible women. Sallie Calhoun, after 25 years as an engineer manager and COO and CFO in the high-tech world, Sallie and her husband purchased Piscinas Ranch in Central California in 2001, which you're going to hear more about. It's an incredible place. Since then, Sallie has implemented holistic management on the ranch to improve the health of the grasslands while producing grass-fed beef. She has also created an event center using restored ranch buildings. Sallie's passionate about restoring grasslands, improving soil health, and recreating local food systems. She sits on the boards of Holistic Management International, Valley Verde, and the Women's Fund Advisory Group at the San Benito County Community Foundation. She is the president of the I Have a Dream Foundation in Clio, South Carolina, and manager of the Globetrotter Foundation, a family foundation. She's also a member of BALLE's Local Economy Investor Circle. So as you can tell, Sallie Calhoun is someone that you're going to get a lot out of when it comes to not just soil carbon, but also ways that finance, investment, while being a practitioner, can come together to make sure that we can solve these problems quickly. Now, Euneika Rogers-Sipp is our other presenter. She's a restorative designer and communitarian who specializes in strengthening ecological systems. The organization she founded, I'm going to butcher this, Euneika, so please correct me if I'm wrong when you begin your presentation. SUREF, I think is how you say the acronym. It supports families residing in rural areas and expanding their opportunities in new areas of economic development, particularly in renewable energy, agricultural production, and tourism, all things that are very close to my heart. Euneika has, for over 15 years, helped start up for-profit and nonprofit social enterprises in the field of sustainable development, both nationally and abroad. Euneika has researched sustainable rural economic development at Antioch University and the Rural Development Leadership Network, and she holds a certificate of rural community development from the University of California, Davis. She is a 2015-2016 Harvard Graduate School of Design Loeb Fellow in Equity and Social Impact Design, and also a 2014 BALLE Fellow. We're going to begin this webinar with Sallie providing a bit of context with a presentation about the science of soil, and then we're going to hear from Euneika, who's going to provide context about the bringing together of community with soil and regenerative agriculture. So with that, I'm very pleased to hand it over to Sallie for the presentation.
Well, thank you, Nikki. It's great to be here. I'll start. I'm going to try to do soil science in 7 minutes again. It's always a challenge. So if I'm going too long, shorten me up, but I'll try to get it all done in 7 minutes. Some of you are probably thinking, I don't understand, we don't normally talk about soil and climate change with each other in the same context. So I'm here to explain why soil is probably the most important thing we should be talking about when we talk about climate change. How is soil related to climate change? Turns out there's a finite amount of carbon here on the Earth. It was made when the Earth was made. This is all we've got. It's a really important element, and it presides mainly in 4 different places. It's in the atmosphere, it's in the biosphere, which is the plants and animals on the planet. It's in the soil, amazingly enough, and then there's a lot of it in the ocean. And what people don't understand is that the amount of carbon in the soil, generally, and that's part of the life of the soil, is currently 3 times the amount of carbon that's in the atmosphere. So people will say to me, soil, how can that make a difference? It turns out that even with all the carbon we've lost from the Earth's soils, again, as I said, more than 3 times as much as currently in the atmosphere. So, and what much of that carbon that is in the atmosphere now actually used to be in the soil. It turns out that before man invented agriculture, there was dramatically more carbon in the soil. And what I'm going to talk about is how we might be able to impact climate change, plus have a lot of other great co-benefits by putting that carbon back into the soil where it belongs. All right. In the next slide, the most important point I want to make is that life is carbon, and carbon is life. When you were in grade school, you probably learned about how water cycles around on the planet. Well, it turns out that carbon cycles in sort of that same way. And when we talk about soil organic matter or improving soil health, what we're really talking about is putting life back into the soil. I think Michelle from BALLE once asked me, so if we want to put carbon in the soil, what do we manage for? And the answer is we manage for life. So it's a really exciting and hopeful message that by managing our soils differently, we can essentially do what people are calling a no regrets negative emissions technology. That means that basically we're able to suck carbon out of the atmosphere and put it back in the soil, hence the negative emissions technology, offsetting carbon emissions. And the reason we talk about it as a no regrets approach is that even if there were no climate change, what we really need on Earth is much healthier soil. It turns out that soil carbon and water go completely together. The more soil organic matter you have in your the more water you'll have. So if we go to the next slide, please. Oh, okay. So water follows carbon, and as the slide says here, the world's cultivated soils have lost between 50 and 70% of their original carbons. I said a lot of the carbon in the atmosphere used to be in the soil. This slide says 50 to 70%. The numbers that I hear from farmers indicate that it's probably much higher than that. The United States government estimates that back in the 1930s, in the top 12 inches of soil, there was 6 to 8% carbon. Their guess is that we now have 1.5 to 2% carbon in the top 12 inches, which would be a factor of maybe a quarter of what we used to have. Many of the farmers I know that are taking over conventionally managed row crop ground are starting out with 0.5% soil organic matter in their soil, which means they essentially have no life in the soil. And what would we get if we could restore that soil health? We wouldn't just suck the carbon out of the atmosphere. The other benefits that we would get are we would have better resilience. I had the most amazing conversation a few weeks ago with a farmer in southern Georgia who farms in a place where they get 60 inches of rainfall a year, which to me from California sounds like more rain than you could ever possibly want. But he doesn't have a center pivot for irrigation, and he calls himself a dry land farmer. And he was explaining to me how difficult it is to make a crop when it gets hot in the summer and it stops raining. And it turns out that the reason for that is his organic matter is probably down to 0.5%, which means that the water falls on his land and the water just cannot stay. It runs off. And basically 2 or 3 days later, if it hasn't rained, he has no water left. So he's living in a constant state of drought, not because he doesn't have enough rainfall. 60 inches of rain is plenty, but because he can't hold the water in the soil. So we would have better resilience in the face of drought and changing climate if we can improve our soil health. We'll have more nutritious food. It turns out that the way the nutrition gets into your food, say your fruits and vegetables, is through the life that's in the soil. It's not from the fertilizer, it's the life in the soil that actually transfers nutrients into your food. We would require fewer inputs. Right now, farmers are buying all kinds of herbicides, pesticides, and fertilizers from the big corporations. A lot of those things are making up for the fact that we basically have damaged our soils so badly that it's hard to make a crop without these external inputs. And that's putting tremendous economic pressure on farmers. So we can have more economically viable farmers as well. We'd have less erosion and we'd have less flooding. So water and carbon and soil, life and health are all just inextricably linked. As Nikki said, this is kind of where all of these amazing things come together. So we've lost all this carbon. How can we put it back? I'm sitting here saying we could mitigate climate change if we just suck a little carbon out of the air and put it back in the soil. Well, how on earth would that happen? It turns out that the way that happens is through the use of plants. And it's the power of photosynthesis and it's the power of solar energy. I think one thing I'd like you to take away from this, if you can, is we have historically underestimated the amount of damage that we're able to cause with our management, particularly of agricultural soils. And now we're underestimating the amount of good that we could do working with nature. Our friend who says we need to take back anthropogenic change and we need to make it positive. So if we move on to the next slide, it shows a little bit about how we can put the carbon back into the soil. You see, we have solar energy and we have a green plant. You learned about photosynthesis about the same time you learned about the water cycle in grade school. Basically, photosynthesis takes CO2 from the atmosphere, splits that molecule, takes the carbon and makes complicated sugars and lets the oxygen go back into the air. And what we've learned recently is those complicated sugars don't just help the plant grow, a lot of them actually go out through the plant roots. For a long time, botanists thought that's kind of a waste, but I guess those are just waste products. The plant made more sugar than it needed. What we realize now is those sugars are made specifically to feed all of the life that lives in the soil. And the way you get more life is you get more of those sugars. So the plants and the animals in the soil are inextricably linked. You know, in the same way that I can't lie on a beach and sunbathe and get energy, I have to eat. The life of the soil has to have energy also from the sun mediated by the plants. And it turns out that the more the plants do this work, the more life we get in the soil, the better the plants grow, and the more carbon we have. So it's this great virtuous circle. And the wonderful thing is we know how to do it today. We're not doing a very good job of it. We're doing a great job of getting rid of carbon, but we know how to do a much better job. So if we just think about the more life we can have above the ground, below the ground, the healthier soil we'll have and the healthier planet we'll have. So we really can make a huge difference with this. It's a big deal. Even though you can't see what's happening under your feet, it's like a really big deal. So I think that's it for my start.
Thank you so much, Sallie. That was a wonderful presentation. And now I would like to invite Euneika to talk about her work.
Hello, hi. Thank you, Nikki, for that introduction. And thank you, Sallie, for that wonderful presentation. I always am just moved by the science that you bring to this conversation, and always with you, Nikki, with the inspiration that you bring. So I'm going to talk about the region that I work in the Black Belt. I started my work in Alabama. I was asked by an elder to come and work on her 40-acre farm. And she was using her farm as an outdoor classroom. And she thought that children would know everything that they needed to know about themselves and also about the environment and what they would need to do in life if they had this classroom experience. And so that got me involved in working in Alabama, in that region, which that particular county, Wilcox County in Alabama, is the poorest county in the state of Alabama. And so if you go to the next slide, you'll see one of the things before, I should sort of preface this part of my conversation or my narrative with one of the things that kind of got me into working in agriculture, because I never really thought I'd work in agriculture. I started off working in fashion, sustainable fashion. But in 2001, I heard a lecture, I was invited to the Pioneers Conference in California, and I heard a lecture by J.L. Chestnut, who's a notable civil rights attorney. And he was talking about the Black farmers' lawsuit. And he mentioned, it was the Pittsburgh case, it's known in the media as the Black farmers' lawsuit. And it was the largest civil rights settlement in the history of the country, with the government paying out more than $2.5 billion to thousands of African-American farmers nationwide, and where thousands of acres of farmland that had been halted from production were being put back into production. And that quickly sort of shifted or pivoted my focus and got me more calibrated into the actual region across state lines. I was born in North Carolina, a rural tobacco town, and cotton town, Reidsville, North Carolina, which people know outside of Greensboro, the Durham area. And it speaks to the history of soil depletion. But my awareness as a young person and as a young leader was not quite grounded in that. And so that conversation got me grounded into the realities of what folks who have inherited their land in the South, African Americans particularly that make up the South, the Black Belt South, were going through as farmers. And the other side that you'll see, if you go to the next slide, is also the second piece of the work that sort of framed my last 10 years of work in the South. And that is, I met Dr. Robert Bullard, who is known as the grandfather of environmental justice. When I met him, he instantly became a mentor. He passed his book to me, Dumping in Dixie, Race, Class, and Environmental Equality. A lot of people, if you don't have it, I recommend that you get it. It is a very important book to have. But that book also helped me understand, it sort of centered equity and fairness and the struggle for social justice by African-American communities, particularly around discriminatory facility practices, and how they had been contributing to sort of the imposition of all types of toxins on our communities, and then the sort of siting of garbage dumps, hazardous waste landfills, incinerators, smelter operations, paper mills, chemical plants, you name it, a whole host of polluting industries. And so I wanted to really sort of preface the talk with those 3 points. The Living History Farm, which was one of the more recent experiences in 2007, but before that, in 2001, leading up to that time, the awareness of environmental justice and the sort of frontline issues that our families are facing in the region. Because, you know, the most important thing about any intervention, and particularly about the opportunity that we are talking about in terms of soil, and I do agree with Sallie's statement that soil is the most important thing we should be talking about. And our farmers really know that. But I don't feel we can talk about it without talking about it within the absence of people who live in the region, and without really being grounded in the realities of what it takes for those folks to be able to integrate fully into these practices. So I just wanted to preface with that. You can go to the next slide. So that's the region. I think it's good to actually have a graph So you can see when I speak about the Black Belt region, a lot of times you'll find academic studies that focus to one state, the state of Alabama. But as you can see, that crescent shape that sort of starts up towards Virginia and all the way down through Texas is known as the historic Southern Cotton Belt. The slide to the upper left-hand side shows those little dots. So historically, every dot represents 2,000 bales of cotton at that period. I think it's in the early 1900s. And then over to the right, you'll see a breakdown of the three main cash crops in the South. Cotton being the green one, the green area, and then of course tobacco, which I mentioned in terms of North Carolina. You can kind of see where I'm from by seeing the tobacco pieces there in North Carolina on the border of Virginia and North Carolina. And then of course sugarcane and rice. Actually, it's four main crops. So just to give a context of what we were moving that helped lead to this great depletion we were talking about. And then the larger map just shows the percentage of African Americans. So we are residing in what people are calling the nation's third world because of the economic and political vulnerabilities. And that is the reason why, with that information, I felt compelled to focus my area of work on the growing number of African American families in rural communities that really have lost their ability to access and manage potential markets. And that's why I started SUREF, Nikki, which is Sustainable Rural Regenerative Enterprises for Families. You can go to the next slide. So our first project, this map, you can probably skip that. We can go because the map is the poster on the side. You can keep going. The poster on the side was the poster of solar irrigation. You can pass. You can keep going. Yeah, go back. You can see. Yeah, the one right after the poster. You have that? Okay, so we can skip that. Sorry about that, guys. All right. Yeah. So actually, I'll tell you a little bit about our first project, and then we'll go straight into some of the case studies. Sallie mentioned Southwest Georgia as an area that she recently spoke with a farmer about, and these actual images that you're seeing are in Georgia. And before we get there, our first project that we worked on was is sort of a response to families. I had interviewed over 500 families throughout Alabama and Mississippi, and this was happening while I was a consultant with Heifer International and also with Alabama Sustainable Agricultural Network. And the technical assistance that we provided to farmers were really in the film of sustainable agriculture. And there was I felt as though a lot of times, and what was being told to me is that the assistance was sort of a Band-Aid approach. It wasn't long-term enough, and it wasn't getting to, again, what I was saying in terms of business development. But more importantly is that when you're faced with the inputs that it takes and you're economically deprived, meaning no access to capital, socially disadvantaged, been discriminated against for generations, it's extremely difficult to maintain the type of relationships that you need with the USDA, the federal agencies that actually provide the support, the National Resource Conservation Service. For example, our organization was set up to really act as an intermediary. And what we did was we worked with those families. We provided technical assistance, we did research, and we introduced them to, for example, alternative energy and renewable energy, drip irrigation that is combined with, for example, solar power. So we were able to move water from long, far away to help with the watering of crops and also to feed the animals. And so this was a really important project for us in the beginning, and it was really helping us to solve the family water access issue that we had. Many farmers, surprisingly, are still using things like water hoses to water their crops. You cannot be competitive that way, and it's not really the most efficient way, of course, to manage with water on the land. So that's what we started with first. These images.
I was just going to say, Euneika, and before you get into some of the more specifics about the images in the case studies,
right.
I'm curious about, I want to repeat some of the things that you just said to make sure that
Sure.
people listening get a chance to let it sink in. So some of the political, economic, and social container that agriculture sits within in America is that there has been a pretty complex history.
Yes.
Slavery and genocide of American Indians and Native Americans, and the purposeful and pretty specific taking of land. And so one of the things that Euneika is speaking about is that when we're talking about regenerative agriculture, we're not just talking about the land. We're also talking about the families and the people, because we as humans are animals in an ecosystem as well. And the pretty deliberate destruction of the African-American farming legacy is something that we can regenerate when we regenerate agriculture. And
Yes.
so before we get back into some of the specific case studies that you were talking about, I wanted to begin the moderated discussion and bounce back to Sallie for a second, because Sallie, Euneika was mentioning some specific regenerative agriculture techniques and things that farmers may have been doing, still using hoses, for example, without really understanding some of the more complex ways complex and simple ways, actually, that they could better interact with water. And so, Sallie, I'd love to hear some of the regenerative techniques that you're using at Piscina's Ranch, and then move back into some of Euneika's other case studies.
I'll throw out one. I think we may have a slide, but one of the things we're working on that ties into this well is we're getting ready to plant a vineyard in the spring of 2016, and the vineyard will be set up to try and minimize the amount of, this is the design picture of the vineyard, to really minimize the amount of inputs that it takes and to stack enterprises. So this will be a vineyard that is primarily made up of grapes, but is also a polyculture. It'll have hedgerows in it, and then within the rows of grapes, it will also have fruit trees. So we're trying to create diversity above ground, which helps create diversity below ground. The most interesting part about it probably is that it will be trellised up high, and the design is such that sheep will be in the vineyard all year round, and the ground, so they'll be grazing and the ground will be covered. And in some trials that have been done, this reduces the irrigation water necessary to grow grapes here in California by about 90%. So I think, as Euneika was saying, there are tremendous opportunities to rethink the way we're doing this agricultural design, to think about it as a system and to think about stacking functions. And as you said, I mean, it's the people, it's the animals, it's the plants, the soil microbes, and it's how we get them all to work together to accomplish as much as we can by putting as little as we can in. So that's one of our exciting projects. But and sort of the general thing we're trying to do is to work with nature and to reincorporate animals into the growing of food as an integral part of that system. Just as Euneika's picture showed cattle out there. I mean, animals are a really important part of this solution and design process.
Mm-hmm. And if we could go back to Euneika's other slide that she was just speaking about as well, with the solar panel on it. Euneika, listening to Sallie talk about the incorporation of animals and the growing of food, one of the things that strikes me is that there are a lot of policies in place that do not allow for the growing of food and the integration of animals. And it seems like a lot of what you're doing in the South is supporting communities that may not have had policies or infrastructure in the past that have been designed to help them. Your organization is supporting them to have the kind of infrastructure to allow them to thrive when it comes to investing in training farmers, et cetera. So I would love for you to speak about that as well after you finish up the case studies that you were just talking about.
Sure. Thanks, Nikki. I'd love to do that. I appreciate that, you mentioning that about the policy pieces and also sort of slowing up a bit to hold really what we're talking about when we're talking about African-American families in the South, you know, and the ability for quality of life and the tremendous opportunity, but also the incredible injustices that we're facing still today. So thank you for that. So the images that I wanted to show, these come from one of our advisors, Dr. Gary Calhoun at the University of Georgia. And some of the families that a couple of family farms that we're working with in Georgia, and a new project that we have started on. And there is important. So at the end, I'll show that, and then I'll show also some ground coverings that are from Appalachia and are not they're not really practiced as much with the families that we work with, and I'll explain why, but it is part of a collection or a portfolio of practices that we are looking to sort of integrate in a full package for our families to address. So these first two slides, again, are, well, you can go to the next slide, sorry. It should be about 4 slides. No, it should be, keep going. Should be cover crops. There we go, right there. Thank you. Yeah, so that's Appalachia, right? The slides are a little different than I had set them up, I think, but anyway, we'll just jump in. So these images here, this first image on the left, this is a cover crop from Appalachia. This is tillage and radish and spring oats, and it's sort of an example of a fall and winter crop on the left, and on the right is spring oats, and that's an example of sort of early spring. You can get to the next slide. The slide on the left is sort of in the warm season. It's a cover crop. It's buckwheat and sort of midsummer. And then on the right-hand side, we have rye and clover. Oh, actually, this is so I'm sorry. The right-hand side is the organic no-till. And potato plants, actually, that are being used. And you can go to the next slide. Yeah, so go back, sorry. I apologize to everyone about this. So I just wanted to show those. Some of the families that we work with, many of them are using various aspects of these types of processes. I just wanted to show the potential to build soil in organic matter while we're also, you know, raising crops for market, because this is really the ideal situation when we talk about regenerative soil. We want to be able to do this while we're also being able to access the market. Incredibly challenging, we find, but this is the goal nevertheless. And so using cover crops is one of the ways that we do it. It's a no-till technique, and it again, Sallie had mentioned that earlier. It's a way in which you can really build organic matter. It improves the soil. It reduces the farmer's dependence on fertilizer. And it definitely helps with weed control. These are basically no herbicide, no tillage practices. And let's see, we'll stay on that one. So I just wanted to make the point that these practices really aren't as popular in the Black Belt region and with the farmers that we're working with, because we're really kind of struggling with, most of our families really struggling to survive, quite honestly. The persistent poverty rates have not changed much in over 100 years in our region. I'm not going to get into all the statistics with those, but it's important to know that that is actually having an impact, again, as I mentioned, for families having the ability to integrate these methods. But it does help overall, as the studies have shown, with improving the bottom line financially. And the other thing to know about this is that, the average size of a family farm that we work with are generally around 30 to 50 acres. And so in production, you'll have maybe in the beginning an acre, particularly if it's a new sort of operation for a person who is managing that land. Because when I say new operation, families have inherited the agricultural legacy. It could be a fourth or fifth generation farmer, but you as the person that is actually managing that land could be a singer, which is a real life situation of Sandra Simone and Huckleberry Farm that we're working with in Alabama. She actually sings, she lives on her land, and she took up farming because of, her love of the environment and her love of her family's heritage, the rich heritage. But she really didn't know it like that, and she wasn't as skilled as she needed to be in those areas. So, addition to the cost, there's a pretty large amount of labor that goes into the management of these techniques. And so a lot of times those are the kinds of things that keep people from adopting the techniques in the first place. We try to do things like farm tours. And that became very popular for us, demonstrations to actually show one farmer to the next, if they see their neighbors adopting a practice, and they see, the numbers that says, okay, this is something that's going to actually help me with my overall productivity and my profits, then they're more likely to adopt. And the other part of it is that I wanted to mention is that really the cover crop seeds are not really that expensive in and of themselves. They any ranges anywhere between $50 to $100 an acre. But again, the additional time that it takes, the extra planning and the management that is involved is pretty substantial. So if you go back to a couple of slides back, you'll see a photo of a group of people holding some manuals. Go back again. Should be right there. And so one of the things that we did to help with this incredible curve, this learning curve, and the ability to adapt these practices is that we introduced a curriculum. It's a 11-module curriculum. It's an environmental literacy curriculum, and it's also a local empowerment and organizing tool. But there is one whole section, and we've really been sort of adapting this, customizing really the curriculum for the region. But we have a whole section that is food, soil, and agriculture, and health. And that has been incredibly powerful. 17 people have been trained, local leaders, all who have inherited land and are working to train other people on these modules. And so what we want to do is and if you go to the slide that's following this, we want to continue to grow our network because what's happening is now that we are seeding, these local leaders are now taking the knowledge that they've gained about soil conservation, about soil health, and their ability to impact climate change in a sustainable business. And they're going off into their respective communities, anywhere from Louisiana across. And so that's really what we want to see. We want to see the impact scale up from there. And that's one of the ways in which we're approaching it in terms of education.
Yeah, that's pretty incredible, Euneika. And I think that one of the things that strikes me about what you just shared is the integration of very tangible techniques when it comes to support of these families and making sure that they understand the technical assistance parts. of what it is to be holistic land managers with the investment and infrastructure and just community building part that's really part of the legacy of being a Black farmer in the first place. And to have an organization that approaches it from all three perspectives feels really important. And so then thinking about that aspect when it comes to building community, getting back to you, Sallie, I am curious, taking it back a step when it comes to climate and carbon. We just heard Euneika talk about organizing farmers in the Black Belt, and I know that you've been doing a lot of work when it comes to working with farmers in the state of California and thinking about the ways that we can sequester carbon that can influence policy and that can influence the larger conversation about how to draw down carbon from the atmosphere. So I'm curious, there's so many directions we could go with that. You could talk about your investing and the way that you support farmers that way. You could talk more about Piscinas Ranch and some of the things you hope for. But I'm curious about your just big picture overall thoughts about the way that these things integrate.
You're right. Not an easy question, and I just want to make the point too that it's not like the farmers that Euneika is working with are behind the rest of the farmers in the country in terms of these practices. I think there are roadblocks everywhere. We find them. Many of the roadblocks are, right here in our heads, but a lot of them are on the ground, and that's true. I think maybe 1% of all the land in the United States is cover cropped. So we are all right at the beginning of trying to do this, and so I think in the big picture, there's sort of two directions to approach this. One is to create this community, just like Euneika's been doing in Alabama, and we've been trying to do here in California, a community of people who can learn together and experiment together and can really push the edge on what's possible and help each other figure that out. And we've been working on doing that for about 5 years. With a slide here of one of the workshops that we've done, and we find that it's not your neighbor that picks up the practice. It's somebody maybe 3 counties away, but who has an experimental bent to them. So we're working on creating that broader community, in fact, all over the world. And then in California, at least, we also have a policy component where I think for the first time ever in the United States, California is about probably to pay farmers to sequester carbon in their farmland, which is actually a pretty exciting thing to see happen. I think we're yes, and it hasn't happened yet. I shouldn't proclaim it a done deal, but it looks like it's probably going to happen, and I think that will be a real step forward from a bigger picture in terms of an entity like California saying, if we're going to meet our emissions goals, we see agricultural land and carbon sequestration as an integral part of that. And in fact, we probably don't see how to get there without that. So that'll be really a milestone. I mean, I can't wait till we see the headline, California pays ranchers to sequester carbon, because I think that will be an important day in terms of bringing this into the mainstream and giving it credibility, giving it heft, and putting some money behind it. Because it's hard, like Euneika said, it is hard to change what you do, particularly when you're taking on all the financial risk of changing practices. I hope I didn't in the soil science part make it sound easy, because it's not easy. We know what to do, but actually doing it and making money doing it is not an easy thing. And people need a lot of support and a lot of help. People all over the world, in fact, do. So that's what we do on the investing side and also on the philanthropic side. I started out wanting to grow grass and quickly realized that, well, we have to grow our farmers, because we can't possibly improve soil health and address climate change using ag soils unless we have a lot more people working on the land, making good livings doing that. So we're investing and we're granting all around this question of how do we keep farmers in business so we can all work together to figure out the right things to do.
That's great. And I want to emphasize the fact that you two are working in different regions. You are thinking about the same issues. You're working with different types of farmers from very different types of backgrounds, I'm sure. And yet, the way that you're approaching your work feels very similar. We know that we need to invest in farmers. Both of you were very clear on that point. You both know that some of the reason why these regenerative techniques aren't being used isn't necessarily just because of a lack of information. It's also the intersection of culture with these practices. We've had a culture of agriculture in this country for decades that does not use these techniques. And they're just common practices that everyone thinks are to be used, like tilling, for example, that are just now starting to be called into question. So approaching this soil, carbon, and communities dialogue from multiple perspectives is very, very important. So with that, it is now time to open up questions from the audience. And so if you would like to ask a question, you can go ahead and type it in the chat box, and I will direct it to our participants. I see Joyce and Jocelyn just typed in questions. Please type them in here. So while we are waiting for questions, Sallie, I wanted to direct one more question at you. I'm thinking about what you just said about how hopefully there are going to be some funds directed toward farmers in the state of California to actually sequester carbon. And I'm curious if you could just talk a little bit about the vision. If there's money being directed toward farmers to sequester carbon, knowing that we're in a drought in the state of California, knowing how many crops California produces for the rest of the country, what do you feel is the potential if this was really deeply understood by both farmers, policymakers, and the general public? Let's start with the state of California first, and then if you want to get bigger than that, you can.
Well, certainly the potential in California, I mean, it's an interesting policy dilemma, right? Because people in California have spent millions of dollars and years trying to prove that one particular practice sequesters carbon. And that's probably the practice that's about to get paid for. And it's an important practice, and it sets a precedent for the idea that sequestering carbon in soil is doable through management and is important. But I think the real opportunity is to fundamentally change the way we farm in California and to take a much more systemic approach and really move away from monocultures and start thinking about soil health, particularly in a state that has really variable weather. It is likely that going forward, we go from drought to flood to drought to flood to drought to flood. And certainly soil health is going to be an important part of taking care of that. So I think it's exciting what's about to happen in California, but it's also just really the tip of the iceberg, and it's not really addressing the system as a whole in terms of farming in California. So we have a really long way to go to think about how we work with nature at a systemic level rather than, as a friend of mine says, the problem is we have this input mentality in agriculture, and we have for the last few decades, right? So I will just pour stuff on the soil and stuff will happen, and I am in control. And it's a much harder thing to move away from that input mentality and to think about the whole system with the people integrated and figure out how to make it work. So we have a long way on the policy front to go before we can talk about the complexity of the real system that we're trying to work with. So I'm optimistic, but we have a long way to go.
Thank you, Sallie. And then we do have a question here that can be posed to both of you. What are some of the resources available to farmers to help them implement these practices? Are resources offered mostly by nonprofits or governmental agencies as well? And maybe from the private sector as well. I'd love to hear both of you speak to that.
Sure. I can start if you like.
Mm-hmm.
So I mentioned earlier that the main resources that our families and farmers are using come from the USDA, the Natural Resource Conservation Service, and the Farm Bill has opened up quite a few grants that are open for socially disadvantaged farmers, limited resource and beginning farmers, and those are the category, the buckets of funding, grant, federal funds that are available that most of our majority, I would say 99% of our farmers are using or accessing. The problem is with that is that, again, as I mentioned, is that a lot of times the applications are difficult to comprehend, even for the most, folks with education and are highly degreed. And I say that because there's the one thing that you will hear about the program that says that everything about you being qualified and that this is the program for you. But then the process of actually going and getting the application from the office and going through the bureaucracy of setting up your farm or making sure that every bit of information that you provide doesn't limit you. I'll give you an example. Kimber Lanning is a BALLE fellow who had applied for some federal funding through the USDA, and she was saying that there was just, as she applied, she sent in her application, she had spent almost 2 months on it, and there was one little piece of information about sort of something like incorporation or her bylaws or something like that, that just eliminated her from being able to get funded. So there are things like that that are really just, I feel, are just way too strict for our families to be able to access the amount of funds that are out there. So those are the primary ways. There are a lot more of grant opportunities that are coming down the pipeline, but there's very little private investment that we're finding. I think that our biggest issue is that we are isolated. Most of the communities are very rural, very isolated. And so the actual links to investors, people who understand the amount of time, the amount, the level of consciousness that it takes to get to this holistic planning that Sallie mentioned, that we are actually not just talking about one farming practice, which is typically the way in which the federal government handles these practices or helps us, sort of move into these practices. We're talking about a holistic system. So when you're seeking to build that type of, intervention, those types of interventions and those types of practices, you really do need funders and investors to understand that it's a slow moving target. It's not going to be overnight. So you don't necessarily find, I haven't found, and we're finding, and that's why it's so good to be involved with BALLE and to meet people like Sallie who do understand what we're actually dealing with and know the needs. My organization, SEREF, what we do is we prepare families to be ready to be invested in. We prepare them we try to shorten the amount it takes. Right now it's a 5 to 7 year trajectory just to be able to get to the point where your inputs, you're actually, you're going from not being sustainable, a sustainable produced farming enterprise, to being one that's ecologically produced and doing regenerative practices. It's quite a amount of work. So those are the primary places that people are accessing support.
Thank you for that, Euneika. That is a lot to think about. And looking at the time, we have a few minutes until we need to wrap up. So what I'm going to do is, Sallie, I would love to hear you address that as well. And what I'm going to do is ask all of the questions that came through, there's only a few, and then let you two have a last thought, and then we will give it back to Leslie. So, Sallie, you're addressing this question about resources that are available to farmers. We also have a question about the vegan movement. The plant-based diet advocates support permaculture without animals. Is there evidence that including animals will add enough carbon to the soil to offset the carbon footprint associated with feeding animals, the amount of water and land needed to raise the animals, etc.? So there's still that question about whether animals are actually good for soil. And there's a question as well about any well-regarded K through 12 curricula, because Euneika, you mentioned curricula, and we were assuming that was for adults, so we're looking for curricula from students as well. And then after we do that, I will make a closing statement and pass it off to Leslie. But to make sure that we keep on time, I might interrupt. So, Sallie, go ahead and make a closing thought briefly, and then we'll take it over to you.
Okay, so I would say that many of the resources are the same as the ones Euneika mentioned. Most people get their advice from the NRCS or from the USDA. What's interesting is to watch the NRCS give advice about soil health without mentioning that synthetic fertilizers, insecticides, and herbicides destroy soil health. you watch their YouTube videos and you're like, boy, they're dancing fast to do this. So people are not getting the whole story, unfortunately, from the place they're getting the story from. But anyway, so there are in California nonprofits working on it, but not a lot. I would certainly agree too. The investing directly in production is very hard to do. It is, you know, we are not going to make an app that solves this problem and sell it for a whole bunch of money. So it's hard to get investment in this field, in the field of production, and I think that's true all over America, unfortunately. So I agree with much of what Euneika said. I have no comment on the K-12 curriculum. I cannot help there. The vegan movement, how long do I have left before you interrupt me? So the vegan movement, there are a lot of numbers going around about the carbon footprint of feeding animals. The reality is if we take the sheep that are going to be in our vineyard, the sheep are going to grow on grass that grows here when it rains. They will have a very, very, very low carbon footprint, and they are an incredibly valuable part of the ecosystem. If you think of nature, there is no natural ecosystem without animals. Animals are an integral part of all of these things. Grasslands all over the world evolved with large herds of herbivores. You can't have a healthy grassland in a semi-arid place without animals. So to me, the vegan movement is based on the fact that there's a problem with large-scale confined animal feeding with GMO crops that are grown where rainforests used to be. And I am not advocating that we should go out and eat lots of feedlot meat. But if we're going to think about this thing systemically, there is no way in my mind that we separate animals from this whole ecosystem. It's just, it's implausible, and I have trouble even figuring out how to address it in a sane way. So, yes, there's lots of evidence that if you add animals to the ecosystem, soil health responds much, much more quickly. I mean, I always ask vegans, do you eat organic vegetables? And they say yes. And I say, do you realize that they are fertilized almost entirely with organic chicken manure pellets? So vegans are a long way from being independent from animals in the agricultural system. So I think we need to build these systems based on the way nature on Earth works. And nature on Earth incorporates both animals and plants. And we'll have to do that to get where we need to get to fast enough.
Great. Thank you for that. And Euneika, do you have 30 seconds on the K-12 curriculum?
Sure, and I just wanted to sort of echo, I agree with Sallie on that. I think it's really important, the two slides that I was showing with the cows, is that, you know, it allows, when you talk about a complex rotational system, sometimes up to 6 to 7 years where, you know, that we've observed that, you know, animals are used to allow, in certain areas, they work a patch of land, and our farmers work them in a patch of land, a certain portion of the land, and it allows other parts of the land to sort of restore and regenerate. I think people should really study that more in depth to really understand the richness and the value of that practice. The K-12 curriculum, I'll say, I haven't seen a holistic curriculum, one that is as in-depth as what we are really trying to go about, but I've seen it through permaculture. I've seen kid-based curriculums that have been adapted, and I'll say to the person that asked that, just get in touch with me. I'm interested always to maybe customize what we're doing for K-12. I think it's a good idea.
Wonderful. Thank you, Euneika. And thank you, Sallie. This has been an incredible conversation, and I will just quickly say that there are a number of implications for this work, but one of the ones that's the most exciting to me is that our climate situation is getting very dire for the most vulnerable populations on the planet very quickly. And to have a way to not only draw down carbon from our current atmosphere, but also a way to actually build healthy soils so that our food and our air quality and our environment can be a healthier place for us, that there is one thing we can do, regenerative agriculture in all of its different forms, to impact all of those things at the same time, is just, it's a no-lose situation. It's a win-win-win-win-win situation. And I'm very pleased to be in this community now and to be with powerhouses like Sallie and Euneika. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Leslie so that she can take us home.
Great. Thank you so much, Nikki. Thanks so much for guiding this conversation. It's really incredible to hear the perspective, Sallie, that both you and Euneika bring in the work that you're doing in your place, and I'm looking forward to continuing that conversation in our next segment. But I wanted to thank everyone else for joining us today. We hope you really enjoyed this topic and got a lot out of the conversation. We will be sending you a link to the video recording of this webinar so you can kind of tap into some of those key points that may have just been overwhelming at moments. You can also explore more resources in our Soil and Nature Toolkit, and that can be found on our website at bealocalist.org under Tools and Resources. Be sure to join us for our next webinar, which will be on November 4th, when BALLE Fellow and former State Senator Eric Griega will moderate a session with Stacy Mitchell of the Institute for Local Self-Reliance on shaping public policies to support local economic development. So it was a great tie-in that we had here of how much policy actually plays a role in moving forward these initiatives. So now we're going to go ahead and transition to our champion member Q&A with the speakers. And we'll take just 1 minute to make that transition while everybody steps off the line. And speakers, I invite you to stay on. And thank you again for all of your participation.